You already know the feeling. The conversation pauses, half a second, maybe one full second. Suddenly, something tightens in your chest. Someone rushes to fill the silence. Someone laughs awkwardly. Someone checks their phone. Someone starts explaining themselves even though nobody asked. And you're just sitting there, watching all of it. You've probably been called quiet, reserved, maybe even cold. People tell you that you make them nervous, that they can't tell what you're thinking. Some people love that about you. Most people don't know what to do with it. But here's what nobody tells you. That discomfort they feel in your silence, that's not your problem. That's data. Because silence doesn't lie. Words can be rehearsed. Faces can be managed. Tones can be controlled. But the way a person responds to silence, the micro-panic, the compulsive talking, the sudden vulnerability, is the version of them they can't edit before sending. Once you understand what silence is actually doing in a conversation, you'll never hear one the same way again. Here's what we're going to get into. Why silence makes people uncomfortable, and what that says about them, not you. Why the quietest person in a room usually has the most accurate read on it. What someone's reaction to your silence tells you about whether they actually respect you. And the one thing silence does that words physically cannot. Let's get into it. Most people assume silence is awkward because it's empty. That's wrong. Silence is awkward because it's full. It's full of everything that hasn't been said yet. And the human brain, specifically the part that evolved to scan for social threats, reads that fullness as potential danger. There's a term in psychology called cognitive load. It's how much mental effort your brain is spending at any given moment. When a conversation flows with words, the brain has something to process, something to respond to. It feels in control. But when silence drops in, the brain suddenly has no input to react to, and it fills that gap with its own material, its own fears, its own insecurities, its own unfinished thoughts. So when someone panics in silence, they're not reacting to you. They're reacting to what their brain just projected into the space. Think about the last time someone didn't text back for a few hours. Your brain didn't just sit quietly. It started writing a whole story. Are they mad? Did I say something wrong? Should I send a follow-up? That's not the silence doing something to you. That's you doing something to the silence. Here's where it gets practical. Next time you're in a conversation, maybe a difficult one, maybe one where you feel like you're being pushed, try saying less than you normally would. Not nothing, just less. Leave a gap at the end of your sentence instead of filling it. Watch what happens. The other person will either sit comfortably with it, which tells you they're secure, or they'll rush to fill it with something they probably weren't planning to say. The discomfort gap is an involuntary honesty machine. But that's just the surface, because there's a specific moment in conversation that reveals even more, and most people walk right past it. Have you ever been in a conversation where someone says something and you don't respond right away? Not because you're rude, not because you're confused, just because you needed a second. And in that second, you see it. Something shifts on their face. A flicker. They recalibrate. They sometimes add more, pull back, or suddenly soften. Or they get defensive about something that hasn't even happened yet. That's called the loaded pause. And it's one of the most psychologically revealing moments in any human interaction. Here's why it works. When you speak, and someone responds immediately, their response is reactive, automatic. It's the surface layer, the scripted version of them. But when you pause before responding, the other person has to sit with their own words for a moment. Sitting with your own words is uncomfortable, because it forces self-evaluation. Did I say that right? Did that come out the way I meant? How is this landing? The pause creates a window for reflection. And what do they do in that window? That's unscripted. Researchers in social psychology have found that people who respond with deliberate pauses in high-stakes conversations, negotiations, conflict resolution, even job interviews, are consistently perceived as more confident, more trustworthy, and more emotionally intelligent than those who respond immediately. Not because they're smarter, because they're demonstrating they're not afraid of silence. And that scarcity of reaction makes every response they do give feel more considered, more real. You've probably heard the phrase, words are cheap. This is why. Anyone can say anything at any time, but choosing when to say nothing, that signals control, intention, presence. If you've ever been in a conversation with someone who actually listens, not just waits to talk, but listens, you know how rare it feels, and why did you trust them almost immediately? That trust, it was built in the pauses. Now, this next part is where most people go completely wrong, and honestly, it's where I went wrong for years too. Quick question. Do you know someone who never stops talking? Not in an annoying way. Just. The conversation never breathes. One sentence flows into the next. They fill every pause before it can form. There's a good chance that person is highly anxious, or deeply afraid of being misunderstood, or both. And there's also a decent chance that person, in any room, is the least powerful person in it. This sounds harsh. It's not a judgment. It's just how it works. People who compulsively fill silence, psychologists call this verbal flooding, are almost always managing discomfort, not communicating information. Every word they add is a brick in a wall they're building between themselves and whatever the silence might reveal. Think about it in a negotiation. The person who talks first usually loses. Why? Because talking is giving. Every sentence reveals a position, a fear, a preference, a limit, and the person on the other side of the table, who just sits there quietly, nodding. They're collecting all of it. For free. Same thing in a difficult conversation with someone you care about. When they go silent, and you start explaining yourself rapidly, even though they haven't accused you of anything, what's happening? You're not responding to them. You're responding to your own anxiety. And in doing that, you're handing them information about your insecurity that they didn't even ask for. The filler reflex is a confession machine. Here's the reframe. Every time you resist the urge to fill a silence, you're not being cold. You're not being difficult. You're just refusing to let your anxiety do your talking for you. That distinction matters, especially if you've spent years believing that silence made you seem mean, weird, or like you didn't care. You cared. You just weren't willing to leak it all over the conversation. That's not a flaw. That's actually a form of emotional discipline most people never develop. And speaking of people who've developed it, there's a specific type of person who handles silence better than almost anyone, and they tend to see everything. Let's talk about what actually happens in a group setting. You're in a meeting, a dinner party, a family gathering, doesn't matter. There's usually one person who talks a lot, running the room, filling the air. They feel important. They feel in control. And there's usually one quiet person. Maybe they contribute occasionally, but mostly they're watching. Ask yourself this, at the end of the night, who has the more accurate picture of what actually happened in that room? Almost always, the quiet one. And this isn't a personality type thing. It's not introvert versus extrovert. It's about where you're directing your processing power. When you're talking, your brain is doing several things at once. It's constructing sentences. It's monitoring your tone. It's tracking how people are receiving you. It's maintaining your narrative. That's a lot of cognitive bandwidth. When you're quiet and watching, your brain gets to do something different. It can be observed without the overhead of performance. It can catch micro-expressions. It can notice who looks at whom when certain things are said, who shifts uncomfortably, who softens, who's performing. This is called observer advantage in behavioral science. People who are actively watching, not zoning out, but genuinely processing, build more accurate social maps than people who are actively participating. That's why quiet people in rooms often say things at the end that completely reframe the conversation, and why it lands so hard. Because it's specific, it's observed, it can't be argued with. If you've ever said something late in a conversation that made everyone go quiet, that wasn't luck. That was hours of undistracted watching paying off in one sentence. And that brings us to the most important part of all this. Because everything up to this point has been about reading the room. But the last piece is about reading a person. One specific person. And what their reaction to your silence says about whether you should trust them. Here's a test. It's uncomfortable, but it's one of the most accurate reads you can get on someone. Stop explaining yourself to them. Not forever. Just once. Next time you're in a situation where you'd normally over-explain, justify, or soften your silence with words, don't. See what they do with it. How a person responds to your silence tells you almost everything about how they see you. If they're secure, they'll sit with it. They might ask a question. They won't escalate. They'll trust that your silence isn't an attack. If they're insecure, they'll fill it with pressure. They'll interpret your silence as rejection, as passive aggression, as evidence of something. They'll demand an explanation for your unexplained mood. They'll say things like, "Why are you being like this?" when you're not being like anything. You're just not talking. And here's the part nobody says out loud. Some people don't actually want you to communicate. They want you to perform. They want you to say the thing that makes them feel okay, on demand, in the exact format they're comfortable with. And when you don't, when you're just quiet, just present, just not filling the space for them, they frame it as a problem with you. That's not communication. That's control. Silence, then, becomes a mirror, not because you're being strategic, but because people will show you exactly what they think of you when they're not getting the verbal reassurance they've come to expect. The people who are okay with your silence, keep them close. The people who punish you for it, that tells you something you need to know. If you've ever been told you're too much because you feel things too deeply, notice things too sharply, or your silence makes people uncomfortable, there's a reason you're drawn to this kind of content. You're not broken. You're just operating at a level most people aren't ready for. If you want to go deeper into how emotionally aware people can stop bleeding their insight into the wrong conversations, the next video covers exactly that. It explains why highly perceptive people keep ending up in one-sided dynamics and what shifts when they stop treating their awareness as something to apologize for. It's right there. Worth a watch. So here's where we landed. Silence isn't empty. It never was. It's the most unfiltered channel of communication humans have. The discomfort people feel in silence, that's them, not you. Their brain fills gaps with its own fears. The loaded pause, the most underrated tool in any real conversation. It builds trust by proving you're not afraid to sit with what's real. The filler reflex, an anxiety signal. Once you recognize it, you can't unsee it in yourself or anyone else. The observer advantage, quiet people aren't missing the conversation. They're getting the director's cut. And silence as a mirror, maybe the most honest test of any relationship you'll ever run. You came in thinking this was about what other people's silence means. But the whole time, it's been about yours. And what it's worth. Don't underestimate it.